Ukraine's drone swarm strikes Russia's fuel train and turns the night into fire. 9:50 a.m., September 14, 2025. 450 Ukrainian drones swarmed toward a Russian fuel train loaded with 12 million liters of diesel and aviation fuel. Within minutes, Russian defenses screamed to life. Panzer S-1S firing thousands of rounds. Tor M2S launching interceptor after interceptor. But they couldn't stop everything. Dozens of unmanned aerial vehicles broke through, slamming into tanker cars. The explosion sent a fireball 400 feet high, derailing the train and igniting nearby depots. Hundreds of Russian troops were caught in the inferno. Moscow immediately counterattacks. Dozens of Smerch rockets and Iskander missiles streaked towards Sloviansk, aiming to crush Ukraine's launch sites. Civilians braced for annihilation, but Ukraine was ready. Patriot PAC-3s and NASAMs roared upward, tearing intercepts across the night sky, while HIMARS answered with blistering counterfire. What began as a fuel train inferno became a duel of retaliation, one that would leave Russia bleeding from its own overconfidence. At 9:45 local time, September 14, 2025, the morning sky over Luhansk, eastern Ukraine, carried an uneasy silence. On the steel tracks below, a massive Russian fuel train stretched for nearly half a mile, its 40 tanker cars loaded with more than 12 million liters of diesel and aviation fuel. To Moscow, this train represented the lifeblood of its artillery forces in Donbas. To Kiev, it was a floating powder keg waiting to ignite. Hundreds of Russian troops ringed the rail yard, armed with rifles and heavy machine guns, while Panzer S-1 and Tor M2 air defense systems stood guard. Radar operators monitored the skies, confident nothing could penetrate their shield. But unknown to them, Ukrainian planners had been watching for 72 hours, mapping every guard rotation, every fueling schedule, every blind spot. For Ukraine, this was not just an opportunity, it was a necessity. Each day, Russian artillery burned through 2,000 tons of ammunition, sustained only by shipments like this. Destroying a single train could silence dozens of batteries for weeks, altering the tempo of the war itself. As preparations neared completion, Ukraine's top commander addressed his staff. General Oleksandr Syrsky spoke with quiet conviction. Russia believes its strength lies in stockpiles and numbers. Tonight, we will show them that quantity without protection is nothing but a target. The words hung heavy in the air, carried by men who knew what was about to unfold. Hidden in the darkness, 450 drones sat ready for launch. Engines primed, warheads armed, and flight paths already locked onto destiny. The illusion of Russian invulnerability was seconds away from being shattered. Do you think 450 drones are enough to derail a Russian fuel train guarded by elite defenses? At 9:50, the silence that had enveloped Luhansk was broken. From launch pads hidden near Kharkiv and Sloviansk, Ukrainian operators released the storm, 450 drones rising almost simultaneously. Their combined wingspan covered more than 7 square miles of sky, a mechanical swarm weighing over 80 tons in total payload. To the Russian soldiers watching from below, it felt like the air itself had turned against them. Russian radar consoles exploded with alarms. Panzer S-1 crews opened fire first, their twin 30mm cannons pumping out 2,500 rounds per minute. In less than 4 minutes, more than 20,000 shells filled the sky. Missiles followed, each launch costing $120,000, while many of the drones cost Ukraine barely $2,000 apiece. Economically, it was madness for Moscow. Tactically, it was a nightmare. The first wave of interceptions was brutal. Roughly 150 drones were shredded in midair, their wreckage raining onto the perimeter. Yet that still left 300 drones, more than enough to finish the mission. Even if Russian defenses hit every target in their sights, too many UAVs remained to overwhelm reload cycles. Tor M2 batteries fired continuously, but each could track only 48 targets at once. The swarm presented 6 times that number. By 9:55, the rail yard descended into chaos. Russian electronic warfare trucks poured out jamming signals at maximum output, but Ukraine had programmed its swarm across 9 separate frequency bands, including civilian Wi-Fi and GPS spoofing channels. For every drone lost to interference, 2 more broke through. Then the inevitable happened. At 9:57, 27 drones struck the fuel train almost simultaneously. The blast consumed 6 tanker cars in under 3 seconds, releasing a fireball nearly 400 feet high and generating heat above 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit. The shockwave shattered 200 windows in nearby Luhansk neighborhoods, and the train itself, 2,500 tons of steel and fuel, buckled off the tracks like a child's toy. Within minutes, nearby depots erupted. Each storage tank contained 400,000 liters of diesel. When they ignited, the rail yard became an inferno feeding on nearly 12 million liters of fuel. Russian troops fled blindly, some incinerated where they stood, others cut down by exploding ammunition. By 9:59, what had begun as a confident defense was reduced to pure panic. Moscow's proud air defenses had fired more than $40 million worth of interceptors and failed. The sky above Luhansk blazed red, not with victory, but with the catastrophic price of Russian hubris. If you value these in-depth reports, hit the like button and subscribe. It helps us bring you more frontline analysis. At 10:15, Moscow's response came like thunder. From launch pads inside Rovenki and Debaltseve, Russian forces unleashed a counterstrike. 48 BM-30 Smerch rockets, 12 Iskander-M ballistic missiles, and over 200 Grad rockets in a single coordinated salvo. Their target was clear: Sloviansk, the suspected launch hub of Ukraine's devastating UAV swarm. The sky lit up as Russian missiles screamed westward at Mach 5, each carrying warheads weighing between 500 and 700 pounds. Within seconds, Ukrainian radar operators counted 260 incoming tracks. If even half struck their mark, entire neighborhoods could be flattened. But Ukraine had prepared. The Patriot PAC-3 batteries guarding Sloviansk were already locked on, their phased array radars capable of tracking 100 targets simultaneously. At 10:18, the first interceptors launched, climbing at Mach 4.5 to meet the incoming threat. NASAMS launchers joined seconds later, firing AIM-120 AMRAAMs worth $180,000 each. Expensive shots, but priceless compared to losing the city. The clash was apocalyptic. In less than 4 minutes, Ukraine's defenders fired 82 Patriot missiles and 64 NASAMS interceptors, creating a wall of fire over the city. Explosions thundered as incoming warheads were shredded mid-air, raining debris across fields and empty streets. Roughly 70% of the Russian salvo was neutralized. Still, one missed and got through. At 22:20, a Smerch rocket whizzed past the suburbs, shattering windows and injuring dozens of residents. Ukrainian losses were much lighter than the scale of the attack, but the damage was undeniable. Then came the counterpunch. From concealed positions, HIMARS M142 systems roared to life, firing 24 guided rockets back toward Rovenki's artillery positions. Within minutes, Russian launch sites that had just fired were engulfed in secondary explosions as their own ammunition stacks ignited. Drones circling overhead confirmed hits, transmitting images of burning convoys and destroyed radars. By 10:25, Moscow's retaliation had failed. Ukraine's multi-layered defense had absorbed the heaviest blow, suffering limited damage while crippling Russian launch batteries. What Russia meant as vengeance only underscored Ukraine's resilience and set the stage for Kyiv's own devastating reply. The battle was far from over. Stay with us, because Ukraine's answer would ignite one of the most devastating nights of this war. At 10:40, after surviving Russia's massive retaliation, Ukraine unleashed its own answer. The order was simple: cripple Alchevsk, the fortress city where Russia had stockpiled weapons for months. Hidden deep in fields and abandoned factories, Ukrainian operators launched another 200 UAVs, this time loaded with fragmentation warheads designed for maximum damage against fuel tanks and ammunition stacks. Almost simultaneously, 4 Vilka-M launchers elevated their tubes, each missile weighing 1,760 pounds with a 370-pound warhead carried enough power to level reinforced bunkers. At 10:44, the first rockets roared skyward at Mach 3.5, their exhaust trails lighting the sky. Drones provided live coordinates, adjusting trajectories in real time through encrypted Starlink uplinks. Russian defenses at Alchevsk scrambled. 2 Pantsir S-1 systems opened fire, their cannons pumping out over 5,000 rounds per minute while launching 57 E-6 interceptors. But the Ukrainian swarm split into waves, decoys diving low to soak up fire while strike drones pressed forward at treetop height. Within 5 minutes, more than 70 Russian interceptors had been wasted on $3,000 drones. Then the hammer fell. At 10:49, the first Vilka-M penetrated Russian defenses, slamming into a warehouse containing hundreds of BM-21 Grad rockets. The explosion ripped through the compound, scattering burning projectiles across a half-mile radius. 30 seconds later, a second missile detonated inside a bunker storing 152mm artillery shells, creating a blast equivalent to 15 tons of TNT. Shockwaves rattled windows 15 miles away. The swarm followed. Over 50 drones crashed into fuel trucks and ammunition crates, triggering secondary explosions. Fireballs reached 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit, turning the depot into a seething inferno. Russian soldiers fled in panic, some abandoning armored vehicles, others diving into rubble for cover. By 10:55, Alchevsk was an apocalyptic battlefield. Flames consumed nearly 40% of the depot, radar dishes collapsed in twisted metal, and at least 300 Russian troops were either dead, wounded, or missing. Ukrainian drone operators calmly watched their screens, guiding the last wave toward command posts and communication towers, ensuring the enemy could not regroup. The counterstrike was complete. What Russia had built over months was erased in 15 minutes of fire and steel. Ukraine had not only survived the retaliation, it had turned the night into Moscow's nightmare. By 11:10, the city of Alchevsk no longer resembled a fortress. What had been Russia's most important supply hub in eastern Ukraine was reduced to a sprawling graveyard of twisted steel and burning fuel. The inferno lit the horizon for 25 miles, visible even from Ukrainian towns far beyond the front line. Conservative estimates placed Russian losses at staggering levels. In a single night, Ukraine had destroyed over 3,000 tons of artillery shells, including 152mm and 122mm rounds, more than 400 Grad rockets, and dozens of Iskander support vehicles. At least 12 million liters of fuel, worth nearly $300 million on its own. The human toll was equally devastating. Intercepts suggested that more than 600 Russian soldiers had been stationed in and around the depot. By dawn, only half were accounted for. The rest were either dead, wounded, or scattered into the countryside. Survivors described chaos, troops abandoning positions, running through flames, some crawling into collapsed bunkers for shelter only to suffocate as fires consumed the oxygen. Russian command rushed reinforcements from nearby garrisons, but they found nothing left to defend. Entire stockpiles that should have fueled weeks of artillery bombardment were gone in less than an hour. The chain of command fractured. Radios fell silent as communication towers crumbled under UAV strikes. Officers on the ground admitted privately that it was the most humiliating defeat since the beginning of the war. For Ukraine, the victory was not just tactical, it was strategic. By annihilating Alchevsk, Kiev had effectively erased 3 weeks of Russian firepower, forcing Moscow to disperse its surviving munitions into smaller depots across Donbass. This reduced efficiency by almost 40%, leaving supply lines overstretched and vulnerable. What Russia had once centralized for strength now became a weakness. Psychologically, the impact was even deeper. Videos of Russian troops fleeing through firestorms, weapons abandoned in the dirt, circulated online within hours. The image of soldiers diving headfirst into rubble to escape drone strikes became a symbol of desperation. For the first time, even Russian state media struggled to spin the disaster. By midnight, the battlefield was quiet except for the crackle of flames. The swarm had vanished, the Vilka launchers had relocated, and Ukrainian operators watched their monitors with calm satisfaction. Moscow had gambled on overwhelming retaliation. Instead, it lost a critical hub and suffered one of the most catastrophic single-night defeats of the war. The ruins of Alchevsk stood as proof. Russia's might was not invincible, and Ukraine had shown the world that precision, patience, and sheer audacity could bring an empire to its knees. By the time the flames in Alchevsk finally dimmed, the scale of destruction was undeniable. In less than 1 hour, Ukraine had wiped out what Russia had spent months stockpiling: 3,000 tons of ammunition, 400 rockets, and millions of liters of fuel. The cost to Moscow exceeded $5.5 billion in equipment and supplies, not including the hundreds of soldiers lost or scattered in the chaos. For an army already stretched thin, it was a blow that cut deep into both capability and morale. Strategically, the consequences were even more devastating. Russia's artillery, which once fired 60,000 shells a day, suddenly found itself crippled. Forced to disperse its stockpiles into dozens of smaller depots, efficiency dropped nearly 40%, leaving gaps that Ukraine could exploit with future strikes. What Moscow had once considered its strength, its massed firepower, was now turned into a liability. But perhaps the most lasting wound was psychological. Images of Russian troops fleeing burning trains, abandoning weapons and hiding under rubble traveled across the world in real time. They told a story no propaganda could erase, that Russian defenses could be penetrated, its supply lines shattered, and its soldiers left in disarray. Ukraine had not only survived Russia's retaliation, it had seized the initiative, proving once again that ingenuity and courage could outmatch brute force. The night sky over Luhansk and Alchevsk would be remembered not for Moscow's strength, but for the firestorm that revealed its vulnerability. If you find this analysis meaningful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support will help us bring you more untold stories from the front lines. Together, we will preserve the truth.